She didn't want to be in the relationship with you, period. You don't deserve her.
Japanese culture has very strong gender roles, but those gender roles are very different from the gender roles that I see people talk about in so-called traditional relationship discourse in the United States. Even though I'm an American, I was born here, I grew up here, I don't fully understand what people are talking about when they refer to traditional relationships, because the only relationship I'm intimately aware of are the relationships in my personal life and in my family life, which are mostly Japanese. Now, in Japan today, people have a lot of different kinds of relationships, but there is a traditional form of Japanese families. And it basically is one in which there's a power sharing agreement in which men have a certain sphere of influence and women have a separate sphere of influence. But the way they worked out this tension between the genders is that women have almost total dictatorial control over their sphere of influence in traditional families, and men have their own sphere, which is quite separate. The simplified way of putting it is, in a traditional Japanese household, the men have authority outside of the home and women have authority inside. So by absolute authority, I mean, in traditional Japanese families, women control all of the money. They are the only ones that have access to the bank accounts. They give men a cash allowance, typically. They make all decisions regarding children and education. All household decisions are made by women. Basically, when the man crosses the threshold into the home, the woman is absolutely in charge in a typical traditional Japanese household. And in exchange for this, men get their authority, in work and business. Now, I am not saying this is a great relationship or even an equal one, but it is one in which there's an implicit understanding that you cannot just have something for nothing. You can't just have one person be subservient to the other. Now, it's not even clear to me that the so-called tradwives setup even really existed in that imagined way in reality. I suspect that even in the so-called imaginary, idealized past of conservatives, that relationships between husbands and wives were not as simple as they think they were. Even if you do have gender differences in particular marriages, there has to be some kind of balancing of the power dynamic one way or the other. Korean and Japanese culture are very similar. I've talked about this before. And I believe it's because we share a common cultural and even genetic root. But we have diverged over the centuries. And one of the differences is that Koreans have evolved a culture that is still very consensus-oriented, just like Japan. People still like to avoid controversial topics. They will try to always get along with what the group wants and so on. Both of the countries have very similar cultures in those respects. But in Korea, there is a point at which Koreans will complain very loudly, and that threshold is lower than in Japan. Japanese also have a threshold like this, but it is a much higher threshold. You really have to piss off a Japanese person a lot before they will blow up at you. Both Japanese and Koreans are educated at a young age to sit down and figure out really, really complicated stuff. And for that reason, I think that's also why in both countries there are very complicated, systems and rules, and and it even shows up in like user interface design, like apps and websites that are very hard to use because they know people will just figure it out. A lot of these websites would completely fail if they were, exported to the US, for example. But I think because Koreans will complain at a lower threshold, especially things that are in person, I have noticed in Korea tend to be much better designed, like queuing up for things, or how you flow through a store, or how train stations are set up, things where you have to actually get something done in physical space. Korean stuff tends to be better organized and set up, whereas Japanese stuff in that area is not as well set up, in my opinion. I think part of the reason is Japanese just won't complain, even though they're, feeling irritated by a given situation. They'll just accept it for a much longer period of time than Koreans tend to do. That's my theory, anyway, about why it's like this. There's sort of both an advantage and a disadvantage to complaining. Both countries, as I said, are very group and consensus oriented, but I think the Koreans have a slightly, in my opinion, it's slightly better balance. I think Japanese should learn to be a little more outspoken.